The sky hung low, heavy with clouds that hadn't cried in weeks. The earth beneath her feet was dry and cracked, thirsting for rain just as her heart yearned for relief. Maria stood at the edge of her late husband's land, arms folded tightly over her chest, not from cold but from the weight pressing down on her soul. The wind danced through the broken fence, carrying dust and sorrow in equal measure, and for a brief moment, she let herself believe she could hear his voice in it. Her husband, her protector, the man who had kept the wolves at bay with little more than his presence and stubborn pride. But he was gone now, lost in a tragic accident that stole his breath and shattered her world. She didn't have the luxury of grieving properly. There was no time to cry on the floor, no space to fall apart. The very next morning after the funeral, the letters started arriving, first from the bank, then from the city office, and finally from her late husband's estranged cousin, each one more threatening than the last. The house sat on a piece of land that had been in the family for generations, but Maria's name wasn't on any deed. It had been promised to her and her son, but not legally secured. Her husband had meant to fix that, but fate had a cruel way of interfering. The land was all she had left. It wasn't just soil and fences and barn doors, it was memory, security, and the only inheritance her son could cling to. But the law didn't care about tears or promises made between lovers. The law cared about names on paper, and Maria's name meant nothing to the courthouse. She was merely a guest in a home she had built with her own two hands. The local officials were already circling. They spoke in polite tones, but their eyes gave away their true intent. Her husband's cousin, Ronald, had made it clear he intended to sell the land. According to a clause in the deed, ownership passed to the next male kin, unless a legal spouse could prove marriage and continued occupancy. The certificate had her name, yes, but they questioned its validity, the time of registration, and even the witnesses. In a community where everyone knew everyone, she was suddenly being treated like a stranger. Maria tried to fight. She met with lawyers, wrote letters, and made pleas to the local council, but all she received in return were cold glances and sympathy-laced excuses. Her savings dwindled quickly. Whatever little income she made from sewing clothes for nearby villagers couldn't stretch far enough to cover legal fees, school supplies for her son, and the mounting pressure to vacate the land. It wasn't just about the house or the fields. Her 7-year-old son, Daniel, had already lost his father. The thought of him losing his home, the only constant left in his world, was unbearable. Maria watched him each night as he played with the worn-out toy tractor his father had given him, unaware of the battles his mother was silently waging. His laughter was her strength and her weakness. She would endure anything to protect that sound. One evening, after putting Daniel to bed, she sat alone at the kitchen table, lit by a dim lantern. Bills and notices spread out like a deck of cursed cards. Her fingers trembled as she picked up a crumpled flyer she had dismissed weeks ago. It was an anonymous ad from someone offering help with property disputes. No name, just a contact number. She had ignored it before. Pride, perhaps. Or maybe fear. But tonight, pride was a luxury, and fear had become her constant companion. She dialed the number. The voice that answered was low, quiet, almost hesitant. She explained her situation, each word a struggle between shame and desperation. The man, on the other end, listened without interruption. When she finished, there was silence. Then, a simple reply: "Meet me by the old granary at dawn." The next morning, the world still dark and cool, Maria arrived at the granary. She waited, heart pounding, until a figure emerged from the shadows. He wasn't what she expected. No suit, no briefcase, straws. Just a tall, lean man dressed like a laborer, worn jeans, dust-covered boots, and a faded hat pulled low over his brow. His name, he said, was Eli. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't smile. But something in his presence felt solid, grounded. She explained the legal clause again, her voice more composed this time. Then, trembling, she asked the question that had haunted her for weeks. "Would you pretend to be my husband?" The words hung in the air, absurd and painful. She expected him to laugh, to turn away, to judge her. But he didn't flinch. He only asked, "Why me?" "I don't know you," she admitted, "but no one else will help. You have no ties to this land, no reason to betray me, and you look harmless." He stared at her for a long time. "And if I say yes, Toz'll stay here, at least until the legal review is done. Maybe a few months, Jew. You don't need to do anything except be present. Pretend. For my son, for the house." He nodded slowly. "I won't pretend with your boy. I won't lie to him." She hesitated. "Then be honest in silence." That was how it began. Eli moved in to the guest room that night. Daniel took to him quickly, perhaps drawn to his quiet nature, or sensing the safety his mother desperately hoped for. They didn't speak much, but the silence wasn't awkward. It was peaceful. Eli helped around the property, mending fences, tending to the animals, and fixing the sagging barn roof. He worked from dawn to dusk, never asking for anything, never complaining. Maria noticed little things: how he always left his boots outside, how he rose before anyone else, how he watched the horizon like it held answers he'd never speak aloud. He never entered her space without knocking, never asked questions about her past, and never gave away anything about his own. It was as though he had stepped out of nowhere, content to exist in the background. The neighbors whispered. Some were suspicious. Others thought they'd married in secret. Ronald grew furious. He accused Maria of forging documents, of conspiring to steal what was rightfully his. But the presence of Eli, tall, quiet, unwavering, silenced most of them. Was like a scarecrow in a field of crows. They didn't understand him, so they left her alone. Maria began to feel a fragile sense of peace. She caught herself humming as she cooked. She started planting flowers again. Daniel laughed more often. She would watch Eli sometimes from the window, his hands deep in the soil, and wonder about his story. Who was he, really? What had driven a man like him to answer a call for help from a stranger? She found herself wanting to ask, wanting to know, but she didn't. They had an unspoken agreement, and she wasn't ready to break it. One night, a storm rolled in. Rain, finally, after weeks of drought. The roof creaked and groaned as the wind howled like a wounded beast. Maria sat by the fireplace, Daniel asleep in her lap, and Eli entered, soaked and muddy from securing the livestock. For the first time, she saw his eyes clearly soft, haunted, and something else, gratitude, pain, regret. She offered him tea. He took it with both hands, nodding once. They sat in silence, listening to the rain. She almost reached out to touch his hand, but stopped herself. This was still a lie, no matter how. Awoke before the sun rose, her body tense, her thoughts scattered. The wind had died down during the night, leaving the house wrapped in a stillness that felt too perfect, too quiet. She lay there for a while, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, replaying the decision she had made, to ask a stranger, a man she had just met, to pretend to be her husband. It felt absurd, almost laughable, if it weren't so painfully real. But the clock was ticking, the land was slipping away, and she had no other option. She rose, pulled her shawl tightly around her shoulders, and made her way to the kitchen. The fire was already lit. Eli had beaten her to it again. He stood by the stove, silently watching the kettle begin to steam. The faint glow of the flames lit his face, casting shadows across his sharp jaw and sun-darkened skin. He nodded when she entered, then turned back to his work without saying a word. It had become a pattern, his presence always felt before it. Acknowledged quiet competence. Silent support. She hadn't asked for a man like this, but perhaps fate had given her what she needed, not what she expected. The first few days passed like a dream, or more accurately, like walking a tightrope. Every moment felt like a test. Could she maintain the illusion without cracking? Could she keep Daniel from asking questions she didn't know how to answer? He had already begun calling Eli uncle, innocently accepting his mother's explanation, that he was an old friend helping around the farm. Eli hadn't argued, he simply smiled, a rare, fleeting thing, and accepted the role with the same quiet grace he brought to everything else. Maria had laid out some basic ground rules: keep to the guest room, be seen occasionally in town with her, respond to officials or neighbors when addressed, and above all, avoid drawing attention. But Eli, for all his reserve, did far more than she'd expected. He didn't just stay, he worked tirelessly. He cleared the overgrown pastures, repaired the broken windows in the shed, and restored the irrigation ditches. Even the chickens, neglected for months, began laying again under his careful routine. It unsettled her how quickly he made himself useful. Not in a threatening way, he didn't take over or question her, but in a way that reminded her of what life had once been. What it had felt like to have a man beside her, not out of obligation or pity, but out of quiet loyalty. She found herself watching him from behind curtains and corners, trying to understand him. Who was this man who labored with such intensity and never spoke of his own past? Once, as they sat across from each other during soup